just tell us, is there an identity or is there a causality between current account and
Chandra, you have to use the mic for
Chandra has the first question.
That's a good method of getting the first question.
No, he had time left. I was asking him to extend his presentation. That's all. Which is, I just want to know, how does it work? What is the mechanism you are alluding to between? I mean, is it that the fiscal deficit generates a current account balance, or is it the current account balance generating?
It's very simple. It's very simple. If you take the equality, because you take into account parameters already, okay? So you're talking about functional relationships. The functional relationship states that government expenditure divided by the average tax rate is equal to exports of goods and services divided by the average propensity to import. And you say, well, which is the most? Yeah. And you say which variable is the variable that's most exogenous? Exports or government expenditure? And what I say is that you can apply the same criteria. Let's say that Kaleskia Pride or Calder, when they compared profits to investment, I can decide as a government how much I'm going to spend, but I don't know how much I'm going to earn through exports. So government expenditure has to adapt to exports.
So we've been writing together for too long. We're like a couple. So I'm going to translate, Esteban. So what Esteban means. Is this on now? Yes, it's on. Look at this. The point is, we discussed the same thing. So my version is, he does the godly stuff with the whole accounts and whatnot. That's why then you're ratios. It's the imports go up, you have a trouble in the, and the imports go up because of the fiscal deficit. So there is a direct connection. The thing is, that's why I said we may discuss what's the issue with domestic, debt and way before you reach any sort of political problem with domestic debt in a Latin American country, in a developing country that exports commodities, you reach and hit the external constraints. So normally, if you try to do something with the fiscal policy to solve the issues that come from you'll end up that it caused external issues. So it's normally the constraint that hits first. It's the external constraint, and that's the nature of the story. So you can, the fiscal issues come from having to have a recession on the caused by the external source. So all of this.
Chandra says we'll discuss it later. Let's go to the back first. Is it okay? We'll collect a few.
Yes.
Okay. And
do it disorganized Latin American way.
Yeah.
we'll collect a few, and please questions rather than long statements.
Congratulations for the presentations. My question is for Karina, which was a wonderful presentation. My question is, what are the implications for debt restructuring or the implications and complications for debt restructuring of green bonds, of labeled bonds, and also what are the complications that you identify for contingent debt of the sort of coupons, GDP coupons, perhaps export coupons? What are the complications these rather more complex instruments imply for debt restructuring?
Thank you. Right there.
Thanks a lot, Hassan Jomert from Trinity College. So my question is to Matthias, and I guess I understood, export plays an important role in your framework, and I buy all your, arguments fully. But is it possible maybe to use net export rather than export over there? Because import part is also that is endogenous, we know, but that is also, driving the whole framework, because that is a drainage for drainage of currency. The second question is about 2012 capital controls, because it is a very interesting situation how and why capital controls fail in Argentina. Because the Turkey, for example, as opposed to Argentina, didn't implement the direct capital controls, but somehow they were able to manage, control financial flows better without even announcing capital controls, because of the fact that there were direct and indirect oppressions and pressure on financial markets, though, Turkish central bank has a lot of other problems, but it was very interesting experience. I wonder what was the main issue over there.
Thanks. Jan and Jerry.
Okay. I want to focus a little bit on the legal issues now, because I think this is something that normally we have overlooked and are extremely important. In the first case is that what's mentioned this morning in the case of Sri Lanka, the fact of the IMF rewriting the legal frameworks for domestic countries. So we keep that on one side. The second is to go back, unfortunately, to the 1970s and to look at what Matthias suggested this morning, this problem of the debtors and the creditors club. The Latin American crisis didn't have a debtors club because it had a creditors club, and that creditors club was 5 very large US insolvent financial institutions. Now, as a result of that, what happened? Well, we changed the regulatory structure, and the regulatory structure gave a very sharp boost to impose capital ratios on banks. Now, this is a legal structure, and that legal structure had as a result the movement of virtually all lending off balance sheet for this range of banks. Now, the counterpart of that was that within the IMF and the World Bank, the justification was, okay, this is great. We're going to set up these SPVs. They're going to issue Brady bonds. Those are bonds that are going to be bought by widows and orphans, and this is going to be more stable sources of finance for developing countries. So we shifted from on-balance sheet bank lending to off-balance sheet bank lending, and we changed the regulatory structure, because now it's no longer the Fed, which is the appropriate regulator for these institutions and for that lending. It's the SEC, which is the appropriate regulator. Nobody went to the SEC and said, look, you have a problem here because you don't have any regulations to deal with default for these institutions. Now, the presumption was in the market that there wouldn't be any default, okay? The Brady bonds were backed by US Treasury bills, so it was never a question that there would be default in this basis. But this is where we had the initiation of the creation of bond finance and the creation of sovereign debt finance, which we're now looking again, and we're trying to figure out how did we get into this mess and how can we get out of it. And one of the reasons we got out of it was in terms of domestic US regulations on regulated banks, in terms of moving all of this stuff to try and protect the US banks who were technically insolvent at that date. I mean, the other problem was, I can't remember, somebody, I think Karina mentioned the fact that, oh yes, these bonds were more liquid and they were more tradable, which meant that the financial system could now generate fees and commissions incomes as a result of this without having to take the risk. So basically what you had done is just to take these, what were profligate US banks, engaging in risk that they did not evaluate appropriately, and pushing this onto the international capital markets. Now, as a result, Elliott Finance, in the end, saw the hole in this, purchased up all of the Argentinian debt that had gone through the restructuring, and effectively annihilated that restructuring, that it had simply eliminated it. So this is the problem that we're faced with, and this is why this is one of these legal issues, which normally we don't see, we don't look at. You don't see when the Fed decides to change the regulation of domestic financial institutions, you end up having a direct impact on the global financial markets.
Thank you. Jerry, and then we'll have you respond to a large volume of questions and conjectures.
Yeah, so thanks for very interesting presentations. And I have my first question follows on something that Jan referred to. So, Matthias, I'm curious. You mentioned this Elliott, the vulture fund debacle, and I'd like to know what you think the impact of that was on the current crisis that Argentina is facing. And then following on that, Karina, I wonder if you could talk some about how to get out of this dilemma that Jan was talking about with these vulture funds coming in, buying up this debt, holding out and making it difficult, if not impossible, to have debt restructuring. I wonder if you had some ideas about how we can get out of that. And for you, Esteban, on your model, as I see it, an implication is, and you can tell me if I'm right, an implication of what you're saying is that the only way that a fiscal deficit or a big fiscal deficit can be sustainable is if it somehow contributes to exports at the appropriate level. And so you need fiscal policy investment of some kind that's going to contribute to export-led growth. Is that the implication of that? And is there any way to get, to the extent to which that's true, is there any way to get out of that bind? Because in the current situations, with what's going on in the world and more protectionism and so forth, it's harder and harder to follow that model.
Chandra and Jati both have put their hand up, but I want to have our panelists respond to each of these questions. Do you want to, can I give it to you first?
Thank you. Thank you for all the interesting questions. I'll start, I'll just stick to the order in which they were asked. So on Paulo's question, the risks and challenges involved in green bond restructuring. I think what we need to bear in mind when we talk about green bonds and similarly denominated instruments like sustainability linked, there are other denominations. Legally, they are not very different from what we call plain vanilla bond. It's a bond. The contract, the indenture works in a very similar way. The difference is that they are issued for some kind of designated purpose, but the enforcement of the purpose itself is also kind of not particularly straightforward, because bonds, as a matter of principle, you can use that the funding raised for other expenditures. So the enforcement is not. I've been following. I don't work with that closely, but kind of that's what the literature and people who are doing doing research on that generally say, and are discussing. So the same problems that apply to bond restructuring in general apply to green bond restructuring. But I do think we need to bear in mind the complexity of some of those instruments, regardless of whether they are green or not. For example, collateralized instruments. So if you have like security and collateral, and there is a default, the creditor will be able to enforce that collateral, at least as a general rule. And that will give the creditor, of course, more leverage because they have something to use the proceeds, they have a claim and they can use the proceeds of that specific security to satisfy their claim. We also have increasingly, and that includes kind of commodity traders like Glencore, etc. In the case of Chad, that was relevant, and also to a certain extent Chinese policy banks who do kind of resource-backed loans. And that is, I saw, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, something about creditors based in the Gulf states as well who are doing this. So this is becoming increasingly used, like what we call resource-backed. That involves an escrow account offshore. So countries that are resource-rich will use the proceeds of the sale of their commodities like oil, etc., or minerals, gold, etc. And when they take on a loan, they commit the resources of a specific gold mine, for example, or oil field, and those funds are deposited in an escrow account abroad, for example. So, to restructure that debt, actually you have an escrow account abroad. This creates kind of distributive dynamics between the creditors. You can enforce that this is a collateralized transaction. So what I'm trying to say, this is not easy. It's a complex process. The more you add to the financial product in terms of adding features to it, it can become complicated. In terms of green bonds or macro-linked, I think, this is, I don't remember, I'm sure someone in the audience will know that. But there was this recent bond where the issuer committed that they said, well, if I don't meet this specific target, the interest rate will go up significantly, right? So you add that to the transaction, so that creates more complications if things go wrong. Or index-linked bonds, which require third-party verification, like green bonds, right? It's like a credit rating agency of targets, social targets. Who will verify that? It's a third party. Generally, it's a private party. So this is not. Or even in the case of macro-linked, there may be disputes about material facts, like a GDP-linked bond. I'm sure you're familiar with the Argentine situation. Then there is a lawsuit where Argentina now is being sued for more than $1 billion, because it said that they used wrong GDP data. So this is all complicates. The more you add, the more complicated. You
said they did.
Well. Legally, what I'm trying to say is, the more you add to that instrument, the more potential kind of claims and the complication from a legal perspective that can be involved in the restructuring. So this is it. In terms of voucher funds, what I must say. Law authorizes the voucher fund. This is all. Law will not. It's a contractual claim. They can sue debtors for the full face value of the claim. So as financially and developmentally problematic this may be, this is completely kind of lawful. What you can do. Unfortunately, I must say, don't agree with that. But what we need are statutory mechanisms to prevent that from happening. A good example is the UK Debt Relief Developing Countries Act 2010, which imposed a statutory cap on what voucher or any creditor could recover under the HIPC initiative to exactly what they would have received if they had accepted the haircut under the HIPC initiative. That was after very kind of, I don't know if you're familiar, there is a case against Zambia in the UK under English law, but that after that, this act was enacted. What we are trying to do now with the debt legislation I mentioned is to extend that to any multilaterally agreed initiative. So not only HIPC so it would be like an open-ended kind of legislation. Yeah, sorry, I spoke too much.
That was great. Thank you. We've got about 12 minutes left for this panel. So
that's plenty for me.
Well, you don't get 12 minutes.
You said it. I'm just following the rules.
You get 9 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. Hassan's questions. I would have to think. I don't think that there is any particular reason. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason to look at exports or gross or net, it's because it's foreign debt. So the way to collect dollars, it's by exporting more than you import in the long run. I mean, you can always borrow. I mean, but borrowing just brings the, sort of the circle goes back. So yes, I probably there's no issue there. The issue of, we'll do it with wine afterwards. Why the capital controls didn't work. I don't think there is one simple sort of explanation of why they didn't. So I'm not against capital controls. I say this very carefully, and the fact is that they didn't work in the case of Argentina. And I say this, they were imposed by Cristina and, the Kirchners, but they were reimposed. The current ones were reimposed by Macri in the middle of the crisis. There is an old Brazilian play, O Pagador de Promessas, that they're trying to save a donkey, and the donkey is bleeding, and this peasant puts cow shit to stop the bleeding, and the veterinarian comes and says, "Oh, this is crazy, what you people, you're primitive." So he cleans that up and whatnot, and it's trying to stop the bleeding and doesn't stop, and he yells, "Bring more cow shit, you idiot!" And it's more or less like that. So that was Macri. These capital controls are terrible. They don't work. Clean this up. And then, oh no, capital controls. So, they do something, but they didn't. At the end of the day, if you have everything against you, and we have had too many things. So we weren't growing. The global exports, we're too dependent on exports of certain things. We are also incredibly dependent. We were, for a long while, very dependent on the imports of energy. So there were many things that piled up. The interest rate, which I pointed one to make my case that I think that was, one of the central sort of stories. So yes, they didn't work. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be used or that they never, work. So that's certainly not my view. For Jerry, I tend to agree with most of what Jan said, and so I don't have much to add there. Elliot, Vulture Fund, the Vulture Funds, that was very sort of, it was terrible in two ways, because, Argentina was, I think, a very successful, restructuring, incredibly successful. 93% of all the sort of, bondholders, it was lots of bondholders, a bunch of Japanese and Italian sort of, retired people, that we sort of, and we paid in full and then some to the vulture funds, and so I think from that point of view was caving just to show that we are going to behave from now on. At the same time that, we open up, and we did get, the crazy thing is Argentina in that period got like $45 billion coming into the country, and then they went out. So it was in and out. And so, it tells you, so I think, I don't know how important it is for right now, but I think it was overall, it's I think in the same vein of what I said about the IMF programs, dollarization, those are things that tie the hands and make it more difficult the next time around. So I think there are seemingly, losses or failures, but they're actually instrumental. So that there are successes of.
Okay, to respond to your question, I'm sorry about the presentation, but I didn't have the last version. The idea is the following, that I think that debt accumulation in these economies proceeds from the interaction of the external sector and the fiscal sector, the fiscal accounts. You have basically 4 variables here that you can work on: government expenditure, the tax rate, exports, or the average propensity to import. If you put it in a dynamic context, then you're talking about the rate of growth of government expenditure, the tax elasticity of income, so you can reduce your accumulation of debt through a contraction, government expenditure, increasing taxes, which is the IMF recipe. Or you can try to reduce the stock of debt by increasing exports and by reducing the import elasticity of income. So if you manage to increase export or reduce the import elasticity of income, you can reduce the stock of debt. Given the fact that the export is a more exogenous variable to which you have to adapt, you can, the policy recommendation would be to reduce the import elasticity of income. And you can do that through structural transformation.
All right, so we have time for about 7 more minutes of comments. I want to, for the benefit of the panel and our scientific community, just collect. I think we'll only have time to collect. So if you have some sort of spicy critique that you want to make of the panelists, please let it go. Leo, you want to start? Chandra, are you? Leo's going to start, and then Chandra.
Hey, wait a minute, I have the mic.
I'll pass the mic. Are you Leo? You're in control. Go ahead.
You're just giving the men a chance.
Right. Hi, I'm Leo. I'm a PhD student here. My question is for Matthias, and as a fellow Argentinian, I have to thank him for his pessimistic presentation. But no, my question is, so I think even before you were in the central bank, you know, I think one of the inflection points was the resolution when they wanted to do the retentions from the agro sector, right, which was in 2008. They wanted to basically increase retentions for the exports of soy and so on. And so my question in terms of restructuring, and particularly now, you know, the big plan of Milei, in my view, is to basically frack the hell out of the Vaca Muerta reservoir, or, you know, sell lithium to Elon Musk, and, you know, basically just vacuum the country. So my question is, you were saying, you know, we can't really pay the debt, and the only function that this payment would have is just basically get more indebted in the very short run, I think. Then how do we actually, because it would have to be much bigger than the retentions, right? How do we prevent this extractivism from not having this sort of debt counterproductive effect?
Great question for the break. Jyoti?
Okay, sorry to have pushed you, Kevin, but no, okay, first of all, Karina, thanks, great. That was a great presentation. I wanted to ask a little bit about what you think of the New York law, which is currently pending and which is doing pretty much what you were hoping the UK law would do, and what implications it would have for helping along a UK process as well. Yeah, so this is to Esteban and Matthias. You're basically looking, I mean, it's that Lance model, right, with the current account. Essentially, it's the current account driving the capital account. It's your deficit. Can you just let me speak, and then you will get your chance, please? Yeah. I'm saying, supposing you think of it the other way, that it's not your deficit which then generates the capital inflow and etc. It's the other way around. It is capital deciding to come to your country. Supposing I posit to you the other option, that you get a capital inflow, and over time that inflow generates a change in the real exchange rate that shifts incentives from tradables to non-tradables. You generate a deficit, or the deficit gets larger. At some point, capital decides, for various reasons, could be a shock in the neighboring country, could be anything, that it no longer wants to be there, it leaves, or it could be interest rate shock, as you described. It leaves, and you have a crisis. So I'm just saying, I'm putting it out there that this is an alternative thing, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have to only be thinking about your fiscal deficit. I can talk, Southeast Asia, the countries that had crisis, 3 of them had fiscal surpluses. So it's not, you know, I'm a little disturbed by the link that is made directly between fiscal deficit and the increased debt. And I'm thinking about a world in which capital inflows drive the current account.
Chandra, and then at the back, is there any third comment? Okay.
Okay. Let me also say what's troubling me. You know, if you look at the conventional argument of neoliberal advocates for fiscal consolidation and austerity, they speak of the twin deficit, that you have a fiscal deficit, and going with the fiscal deficit on the basis of straight, simple macroeconomic identities say that there is a fiscal deficit and there's a current account deficit. So if you're running a current account deficit, it must be essentially because of the fact that you're running a large fiscal deficit, and therefore you curtail your fiscal deficit in order to reduce your current account deficit. Now, this is basically the way in which they pose the argument within a simple framework. Now, the problem is, even if we say that unfortunately this is the way the identities are and this is the way the causalities run, the problem in most countries is if you actually go in for austerity by actually reducing the fiscal deficit, the impact this has on incomes is differentially distributed. And the import elasticity of demand at different income levels is different. So supposing you actually have a situation where it is in the lower income deciles that the income reduces, whereas there is no reduction in the income in the upper income deciles as a result of the fiscal deficit reduction, it will have no impact on your current account deficit, because of the fact that the rich are still going to import their Mercedes Benzes and whatever else. So we have to be careful that we don't phrase it in a language in which we are leaving a window or a door open for a typical neoliberal fiscal consolidation argument. That's all I'm saying.
Yes,
One comment about Matthias' presentation. Yeah. In fact, the simple model you presented, I think it depends a lot on being in a world which is organized internationally around a key currency standard. Because, for example, we could assume that if some countries had the possibility to have their imports, to buy the imports in their own currency or have access to swap lines, you would have a different dynamic in the sense that, well, having a trade deficit would not have any significant impact on your balance of payment or your exchange rate. And the thing is also, I think we have to take into account the kind of development strategy. Because if you, development strategy, we have to take that into account. Because if you take, for example, the case of South Korea, if you look at the work done by Andrew Fisher, you could see that in the case of South Korea, they had trade deficits from the mid-1950s until 1986 something. The first year when South Korea had a trade surplus was a recession, you see. So I think that the way, the type of developmental strategy used by a country is very important to take into account. And about imports, generally we have also to take the imports financed by foreign direct investment, because it's a different case. Because you could have a trade deficit with no reduction in official foreign exchange reserves and no need to issue debt in foreign currency, because part of the imports have been financed by foreign direct investment. So if some countries want to industrialize through foreign direct investment, maybe they will have trade deficits, but these trade deficits, in fact, to some extent, will not create a debt problem because they would have already financed in hard currency by foreign direct investment.
Thanks very much. We are out of time, so if you have strong views on accounting identities or debt restructuring that you want to share further, please use our coffee time to do so. Thanks very much.